This week on Merchants of Change, we have Kyle York. Kyle played college football for the Bentley Falcons before starting his career in sales at Whipple Hill. He went on to become VP of Sales and Marketing, then Chief Revenue Officer, CMO, Chief Strategy Officer, and General Manager for Dyn, who was ultimately acquired by Oracle. He's since launched York IE, an advisory and venture capital firm that helps technology companies grow. Here he is, Kyle York.
I'm JR Butler, co-founder and CEO of the Shift Group, and you're listening to Merchants of Change. This is a podcast about transferring the skills and behaviors we acquire as athletes and military veterans into becoming a professional salesperson. Each week, we'll introduce you to a top performer who will help us understand how they became professional merchants of change.
What's up, kid? Today on the show, we got a special guest, Kyle York from York IE. Kyle, thanks for joining, brother.
Thanks, JR. Great to be here.
I'm pumped, man. Just so for context for any new listeners, we started our show to really give some content to our audience, which, as you know, Kyle, well, we help former athletes and military veterans successfully transition into sales careers. So we try to get, former athletes, former veterans that have had success in sales and business. And, obviously we have a unique relationship with yourself and with York, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But in terms of flow, we like to start with the athletic career, get into the transition, and then we talk about, some of the lessons you've learned along the way. And our audience is, folks that are thinking about that transition, folks that are recently through it, and then we have a lot of sales leaders too that like to listen to the show. So I think our audience is going to get a lot out of this conversation. To start, Kyle, very broad question. What is when I ask you your favorite memory from your athletic career, what's the first thing that pops into your head?
Oh, that's a great question. I played football growing up. That was my main sport. I mean, when I was young, I played baseball, basketball, football, track, but football was my sport. I played all the way through Division II at Bentley. I would say the Friday night lights, man. There's nothing like high school football, Friday night lights. Here in New Hampshire, where I'm from, I played for a high school called Manchester West High School. And we played at Gill Stadium, which is like, 100-plus-year-old iconic stadium in town. And there was just nothing better than those games on Friday night. Everyone came out for it. The bands were cranking. I look for that every day in my career, that rush of adrenaline that you get from that.
100%. Now, I know that you're one of 5 brothers. Was it ever even an option for you, or was that like, you're going to be a football player, Kyle?
Yeah, I mean, my dad was all-state here in New Hampshire. He played at college at Plymouth State University. My family had a sporting goods store. That was our family business. It was called Indian Head Athletics, for any listeners who were from New Hampshire, Southern New Hampshire, Northern Mass. That business was around. He ran that business for over 45 years. So not only was I one of 5 boys, in the middle of 5 boys, my family owned a sporting goods store, and my dad was a high school and college football star. So no, there was no damn option. Football was always the sport that all the siblings took the most seriously. Like I said, we were all athletes. We like to play other sports, but football was the sport we were all the best at. It's funny, like I don't necessarily think we were all like created equal athletically or even the best athletes on our teams, but we just had this like, DNA of the sport and like knowledge of the game and like, sports IQ of the game that, kind of came to all of us, from a very young age. I just loved it. I feel like every other sport I did was really just to get ready for football. And I think every other coach and every other teammate in the other sports knew that with me, certainly growing up.
Yeah. And I think like playing multiple sports, by the way, is something that is getting lost a little bit. But, I think that it only creates that hunger when the number one season comes along when you play other sports. You know what I mean?
Oh, completely. Well, nowadays it's like, you can play outside of football, you can play every sport year round. There's multiple AAU travel teams. Like most kids, even playing one sport, are playing multiple in every given season. It's crazy. I got three kids, 11, 9, and 6. The two older ones are just something every single night, every season. They have their favorite sports. They're all a little different, but yeah, it's very, very different these days. I think the diversity of getting exposure to multiple different, sports is really important. And, of course, you're going to kind of narrow in on your favorite over time, but it doesn't hurt to get out there and be an athlete.
Totally, totally. Now, so you're the son of an entrepreneur, and you went to one of the best business schools in the country. Was that part of the plan? Like, did you go to Bentley because you knew what you wanted to do after college football was over, or talk a little bit about that transition and like where your head was at towards the end of your career at Bentley?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I always say to people, everyone retires from sports at some point. Some people peak in high school, some in college, some are fortunate enough to play after college or go pro. But inevitably, the time in all sports kind of ends, right? For me, even in high school, you still hold on to the dreams of someday playing professionally or being involved in the sport professionally. Uh, I really honestly just looked at New England schools. I thought I was better than D3 and not good enough for D1, right? So, I looked at D2 schools throughout New England. And, D2 is kind of an interesting one in football where it's very big nationally, but a lot in like the Midwest and the South, and not as much in New England. So there really aren't that many D2 programs that are also good academic schools, right? So, there's schools like St. A's, there was Bryant, there was Southern Connecticut, these types of schools that I sort of peaked at. I actually only applied to Bentley, and I applied early. And once I got in, I was in, and that's where I was going. I remember my parents were super mad at me because, what if I didn't get in? I would have been really late to the application process. There's several other schools recruited me, even schools in Canada. I was looking at St. X up there was one that I looked at. But really for me, it was like I wanted to do business. I wanted to go to a good school, and I knew I was D2 caliber football, and I wanted to be in New England, and it just all kind of worked itself out. Really early on, though, at Bentley, I knew I had peaked athletically in high school. I remember it was freshman orientation.
Yeah.
I was walking to the freshman football meeting, like the coaches wanted to meet all the kids at orientation. And Bentley's upper campus and lower campus where all the athletic stuff is, and there's a footbridge. And I remember coming up on a footbridge, and there was a kid wearing a Marshall Faulk jersey on one arm with a do-rag, 6'2", $190 black guy. Here I am, this like undersized, white kid from New Hampshire. We hit the footbridge at the exact same time. I said, "Hey man, you going to the football meeting?" He's like, "Yeah, you?" I'm like, "Yeah." And then I'm like, he's like, "What position you play?" I'm like, "Safety." "You?" He's like, "Safety." I'm like, "Okay, I better work on my studies." Right? I better get internships. I better start thinking about life after football. And literally, that was before freshman season even started. That was the summer before my freshman year. By the way, the guy's name was Tony Seaforth from Lynn Classical. Ended up becoming an All-American, unreal athlete, great, great, great guy.
Yeah. I mean, you guys had some great teams on that Bentley team in the early 2000s, so that doesn't surprise me. Sometimes you got to get
Yeah, no, they're
knocked
unbelievable. I feel like everybody else, I feel like everybody else was like, could have played D1, 1AA, or FCS, right? And I was like, could have played D3. It's like you could go either direction. And there was a ton of kids on that team that were unbelievable. We went something like 43-5 or something in my 4 years there. Made the national playoffs a couple times. Made the absolute best friends in the world. I played and lettered all 4 years. I really enjoyed it. It wasn't the same, as my high school Friday Night Lights days, but from a playing time perspective, but did a lot of special teams, tried to contribute where I could, and really, really enjoyed the experience at Bentley playing football.
I think like broadly, you made a statement that I think every athlete can relate to, which is like, well, I know I want to do business when I'm done when I'm done playing, which is like such a broad like thought. When how did that start to shape into like what ultimately became like a really good sales career? Like, how did the end of your Bentley experience into the job market? What did that look like for you?
Well, I had been fortunate enough to be given great advice to get internships, in the summers of my college experience. And even so much so that like you could get a course credit for doing an internship. I think that might have been in my junior year. So that sort of forced me to go out there, and I had been landscaping or working at the family sporting goods store. So it was like, okay, I'm going to go out there and do that. And I ended up getting into a tech internship at a company called Whipple Hill. That was a private school software company. So they built systems for prep schools. So I'm sure a lot of your listeners either PG'd or went to private K to 12 schools in their upbringing. And I ended up spending 7 years there from intern. I was a marketing major with a management minor. I was always stiff arming the sales profession, right? I always thought it was like, I don't know, like snake oil salesman, right? It's like what you kind of think about watching TV growing up. I didn't come from a corporate environment. I always just thought corporate and sleazy or something. And so I remember I was working in marketing as an intern, but the only opening for a full-time job was like an SDR BDR function, and I ended up talking to a few folks who were a few years out of school, some of my brother's friends, and they're like, "You'd be so good at sales. You're a natural seller. This is what you do. What are you talking about?" And so that's how I got into it. But it was probably a semi-reluctant way that like a lot of people look at the profession, which I think has been softened over time. I mean, this is 20 years ago, but it was something I definitely remember feeling. And I was a very classic ladder climber. I went SDR to junior AE to AE to senior AE. They moved me to California, which was an unreal experience for Whipple Hill. I went and lived in La Jolla and San Diego. They basically gave me Ohio or Mississippi River West. And so I was like, can I go to California? So I did that for a few years. And it was just a great, great, great experience. And if I think the industry you sell in also can really make you pretty well-rounded and give you great experience. And selling into education with the seasonality and the budgets and some schools I go to, I'd be like, I remember Lakeside School, Seattle, Washington. They just had got a $40 million gift from Bill Gates, an alum, to fund all their technology, right? And then I go to another school to be a kindergarten teacher, like a K to 5 Montessori school, and you'd have to adapt your pitch for Bill Gates versus the kindergarten teacher, right? So it's just an unreal learning experience, and it's really what helped me cut my teeth in sales and in value sales and marketing and go-to-market strategies altogether.
Yeah, 100%. What do you think? Like growing up, one of five brothers, multi-sport athlete, playing football at the college level. What do you think immediately had an impact on you from like the characteristics and the mindset that you had developed as an athlete when you were working at Whipple Hill in those early days, especially as a BDR? Banging the phones.
Yeah, I think I think a lot of it comes back to like a couple things, like growing up in a family business. Like if you don't succeed or hit your numbers or make a profit, like you don't go on vacation, you don't eat dinner, you don't get to go out, right? And especially in a big family like that, there was a lot of stuff that was like not in the budget. Like people always joke, you're from New Hampshire, you didn't grow up skiing. It's like that would have been impossible fiscally on the family, right? It just wasn't in the cards, right? So I think, being in control of your own destiny is a very small business entrepreneurial way. And moving into a BDR role where you have to like, eat what you kill, and you have to like, be in charge of your own destiny and not let anyone else do the role for you or feed you. You got to go figure it out, right? So I think it's really like that entrepreneurial mindset. The other thing, I played defensive back right in college. I mean, I played offense in high school too. I played wide out, running back, and I played defensive back. For anyone who's played football, it's not that different to being a goalie or defenseman in hockey, but you're going to get scored on, right? Like people are going to catch the ball on you, and you have to have a very short-term memory to play defensive back at a high level and be able to get right back out there and not think about the last time someone caught a pass on you or scored a touchdown. That short-term memory and getting back out there and ready to work is something that obviously is deeply ingrained in the best to ever do the sales profession. You're not always going to win every single game. So, that's definitely it for me, those couple things. Then lastly, you had to learn, for me, like the football experience in college was unique because I wasn't a star there like I was in high school, right? And so that also like humbled me a lot to realize like this is a team game and we all play our roles, and so moving to more of a special teams contributor. I was like I was rep the NCAA for the Student Athlete Advisory Council. I was like, the most like hilarious guy on the team. I was always, taking people down from the seriousness to the fun of it all, right? Like you just play different roles in your life, and that's a big part of go-to-market function sales teams is you need to be teams and you need to realize your strengths, your weaknesses, and plug the gaps, right?
Totally. As a certified locker room guy, I can totally relate to the everybody needs to play their role. So 100%.
There's a story the
when
guys
you
tell
were
a
at
lot.
Whipple
There's a
Hill,
story the guys tell a lot, JR, on that, where I almost got kicked off the team for this, but it was classic. I think it was around like Halloween time. We had a big playoff game coming up, and I got dared to wear like a, Joe Dirt mullet under my football helmet at practice. And I did this, and everyone's dying laughing for all the warm ups, different drill session, and then we move into like offense, defense, ready to start scrimmaging, doing 7-on-7s, and I'm still rocking this like blonde, flowy mullet wig. And when head coach Peter Yetten, who's like infamous D2 football NCAA coach in New England, saw this, I swear to God he was going to kill me. Until he realized how funny it looked and classic it looked, and I ended up unscathed. Maybe I had to run a few laps, but it was well worth it for the laughs and the calming down it did of the influence of the team.
that's awesome. I love it. So was Whipple Hill, were they like your first startup, Kyle, or were they like more established, or was Dine your first startup experience? Like
No, it was tiny, man. That was my first startup experience. It was tiny. I think when I first joined there, maybe it was 12 to 15 or so folks. I was an intern. I helped with their first summer conference where they hosted clients. It was founded actually, it was a grad of Proctor Academy, if anyone knows Proctor. That's where he had gone, and he saw that there was a technology gap in these schools, and that's why he built the business. Young guy though, when I was 19-year-old intern, I think he's 10 years older, so he's 29-year-old CEO, and just really learned a lot from him. And what I loved about it is it was an in-office culture. I was always visible to him. He always saw me grinding. I wonder to this day and age with remote work how young talent is getting exposure to founders and executives and startups. I think it's an important thing to do to show that work ethic. That was my first startup. It scaled up pretty good. By the time I left, it was really more that I ran up against the VPs of marketing and the VPs of sales who were founding team members, and they weren't going anywhere. And this was '08, and the SaaS and subscription model was really starting to take off. And I just had a firm belief that sales, marketing, and CS needed to be under one leader. And that is not how it worked at Whipple Hill. And I wanted to try to find a leadership role. Again, you got to remember, I was still in my mid-20s. A leadership role, though, at a startup where I could pull those things together. And, that's what I looked for.
And was that the move over to Dine?
Yeah, I was living in California. I got a phone call from a high school classmate. Dime was founded out of Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And I had heard about it. It had moved back up to New Hampshire and it actually leveraged. My brother runs a branding agency, and they had used them to help them brand a move up market from B2C to B2B. They got a whole strategy, booklet of here's the strategy of how to do it, and had no one to implement or help execute. And so I got a phone call from one of the founders one day living in California if I'd ever consider moving back to my home state of New Hampshire and help be the sort of co-founder they never had. They didn't have a business go to market leader in the company. There was about 15 people or so, a couple million of revenue on the consumer side, and they had built a B2B platform for what was the DNS, the domain name system for web apps and website companies. And it seemed interesting to me because it was a horizontal software play, meaning you could sell it to anyone with a website. And I was kind of banging my head against the wall, selling only the 4,200 private schools in the country or in North America. And I was just kind of looking for more, and I wanted leadership, and I wanted something horizontal that had a bigger market opportunity. And it was just kind of the right timing. My wife, Katie, and I were just engaged, living in San Diego, planning a wedding in Boston, thinking about what the next few years would be. And we decided to move back, get married, and start the new job. She thought it was a crazy move. Thought we were super comfortable living near the beach in La Jolla, and you're going to go work on this dorky technology that no one's ever heard of, right? And man, thank God it worked out.
Yeah, incredible. Obviously, like a lot of our hiring partners are startups, Kyle, I'm like a huge believer because of like our shared experience of like the growth you experience when you go work for a growth company, right? Can you just talk a little bit about like, I think we both don't necessarily have the experience of big companies. Well, we kind of do after acquisition, right? But like, what do you think from an athlete,
Right. Yeah.
from an athlete and veteran perspective? Why do you think the startup world should be really enticing to them? Like what about it is so exciting?
Yeah, I think it's the pace, right? There is an entirely different pace to the day-to-day life of working in a startup than working in a corporate environment. Um, it's also the DNA. Like there's certain types of people that work in a startup environment and certain types of people that I like to call corporate survivors of large corporations, right? Just a very, very different sort of existential reality of day-to-day life in both those places. Startups are, we talk startups and we talk the startup space, but there's so many different stages of the startup life cycle too, right? There are a lot of people, for example, who worked with you or I at different stages of growth of our startup journeys before acquisitions, right? The person who joins a $50 million startup ARR startup versus the person who joins a 100K ARR startup might be a very different type of person. I think the earlier you go in startups, one thing I definitely tell folks is you got to be really entrepreneurial, even if you're not a founder. You're going to have to be a self-starter. You can't be looking for training or, mentorship. You're going to have to seek a lot of that on your own. Obviously, Shift can help prepare people for the sales profession. But when you get there and you look around and you ask, where's this collateral? Where's the process? Where's my resources? You're looking at it, right? And that only kind of evolves as the company evolves. And then you get really big where maybe there's too much resources and too much process and too much bureaucracy and too much of that rigor. And that's like the whole other side of the spectrum of being in a large place. A lot of times when I talk to especially former athletes and vets about this, it's kind of like you kind of do need to make that decision, which is like a DNA match for you. Because like I meet a lot of people entering the profession with elite experience in other spaces, and if you need like training and like process and like kind of like MBA brain style work, you might need to go to more of an Oracle or an IBM or a Cisco to get that fertile ground where you're around a big team. If you go really, really early, you're not really going to get any of that for quite some time. So I think it's just really trying to figure out like what you think you need and what fits your personality and your way of working.
Yeah, and I do think DNA is the perfect way to put it. Like, I think my first job, my boss gave me a Boston Business Journal, and I was like, he's like, call these companies and get meetings, and I was like, what do we do? And he's like, look at our fucking website, dude. Like, figure it out, right? Like, so
Right. Yeah.
and by
Yeah.
the way, like that's what I needed. Like, that's my DNA is I need to go figure it out myself.
Right.
That's how I'm going to get better. Some people need that classroom structure that like an Oracle or a Dell offers. It's not one's not better than the other. It's just they're so different, and there's such a gap.
I
Um,
walked in and Dine was incredibly technical. Dine was incredible technical founders, like hardcore engineers, electrical engineers, computer scientists. And I came in and actually they handed me this book. It's written by published by O'Reilly. It's written by a guy named Cricket Lou. It's called DNS and Bind. DNS is domain name system, and Bind is the open source software that the DNS network is built upon. And he said, to sell well here, you need to read this book. And I'm talking, it's like this big. And I slid it across the table back at him. I said, if I read that book, I'm going to be the worst sales guy you've ever seen. And then what the hell would I use you for in the sales process? And man, like I thought he was going to kill me, but it was more that I didn't have any of that, right? These were like kind of more like your peers who were co-founders, mid 20s. I had to go figure it out. And really what it was is if your business was reliant on your website or your web app for business to survive, you were going to take our technology seriously. So we went after e-com brands, media companies, ad tech businesses, SaaS apps, things that without their web infrastructure, if it went down, they were out of business. And that's really how we built our go to market. But it had to be very self starter, and no one was going to tell us what to do. And I think that's the dynamic with early stage that is not for everyone.
yeah, I well said. Couldn't agree more. Now, if a Bentley senior calls you right now, Kyle, and says, "Hey, I think I want to do sales," what's that conversation look like?
Yeah, a lot of it is, I think I want to do sales. Sometimes is they think they're a senior AE already, right? And, a lot of the conversation is sort of educating them on the sales track, right? And like where you kind of need to begin and the different roles of sales and levels of sales and comp plans of sales and quotas and how it all works. It's a kind of an educational exercise. And then the second part of it is back to that stage point, right? Very, very different. I talked to a Bentley grad earlier today, finance and economics kid, very, very, rigid by the book. He would be so bad at sales in an early stage startup, right? But would probably crush it at an established public company, right? That has a lot of infrastructure around it. Maybe that was in a real like value prop, ROI oriented, enterprise solution, right? So, I kind of walk through those things. I walk through enterprise versus SMB, different ACVs, different selling motions, enterprise field sales versus inside versus channel. Like, again, these are not always things that everybody
No.
groks, and they kind of require a bunch of questions to get there. The other thing is, I think like, you and I like ended up getting jobs in software, and then look at us. 15, 20 years later, you're in software. And I remind people of that all the time too. Like where you take that first job just might be where you are in 10, 20 years. And actually, if you're able to weave together a career narrative and a story arc from one role or job or level to another, you will get your career ahead, right? And there was a long period of time, probably in my late 20s, early 30s, where all my friends made fun of me for how seriously I took my job. But then all of a sudden, they're all calling me all the time for career advice or financial advice or wealth advice or all these different things, right? So it's making sure that you find the fit for you, as well is a big thing I focus on.
Couldn't agree more. Now, obviously, Dine had an unbelievable outcome. You guys were acquired by Oracle. You spent a couple of years in the big world, right? That big publicly traded company world, and now you started York IE. Can you talk a little bit about like I always love hearing why did you start your company, Kyle? Like, what was the experience that prompted
Yep.
it, and like, what's your vision for how you want to change the world?
Yeah, I love that. So, along the way in building Dine, we did internet infrastructure. So we focused on high traffic websites and web apps for our clients who are global. And so what that would lead to is a lot of fast growth tech companies would come to us to help them scale their technical infrastructure. And when they would do that, they'd all say, how are you building a brand? How are you leveraging your community? How are you doing demand generation? How are you organizing your sales team? How are you building your comp structures? How are you doing international selling? You start to get asked all these questions. And I parlayed that very early into angel investment opportunities, into independent board roles, advisory gigs. Part of that was like a chip on my shoulder of being like up in New Hampshire where like wasn't necessarily a tech hotbed and I wanted to have options, right? But over time, it ended up being an incredible side hustle, for a lack of a better term, where I had york.ie as my personal portfolio website and blog. And it's where I kind of caught up all my ideas around the startup space. And so, flash forward to leaving Oracle, we were ideating on our next company, and we're like, man, along the journey, we actually bootstrapped Dine to 30 million ARR, no outside funding. We had a lot of like third party help from analyst firms to agencies to dev shops to fractionals. And I just felt like it was super siloed, inefficient, cost prohibitive. The left and the right foot had no idea who we were, contracting with or bringing in. I really wanted to create more of a one-stop shop resource and capital hub for private companies, a la Accenture, McKinsey for startups with a venture arm. And when I surveyed the playing field, there was a lot of venture funds or private equity firms who have operational value creation platforms or operating partnerships, but there wasn't many, sort of big management consulting analyst firms that were sort of being SaaS business model, like tech enabled, offshore enabled, affied. And I thought it was a really unique opportunity to create something special and different in the early stage tech game, and that was the real vision for it. We felt like the institutions that were built to support companies were not helping startups. They were built for bigger companies, and the more they moved up market, the more they left a major gap for all of us at the early stage game that wants to really see impact and value created.
Yeah, and I'll just comment, like, as a partner of York's, like, we've seen how this model can play out for a bootstrapped, fast growth company, and the value of like being able to call one number and get somebody that helps with the platform, marketing, go to market, financial operations, like all the things that, as a non-technical founder who only knows how to sell, has made a huge difference for our business. So thank you for starting the company is what I would say there. What do you think? Like, how important in the startup world? How important is getting go to market and sales right compared to the product, the financial operations, like all the other stuff that it takes to run a business? Where
Yeah.
does sales fall on the totem pole?
Well, it's so funny you asked that, and it's funny we're talking about this now. One thing thematically that actually ended up being entirely the opposite when we launched York IE. So we launched York IE, I did on the backs of my career, which was, operating wise, and even a lot of my investments and advisory work was actually engineering founders who are completely clueless about their business model, their pricing strategy, and their go to market. And that was the beginning of my career, right up until York IE. And that's what I actually thought was our unique capability. Like, let's go partner with engineering founders, technical founders, product people. And that's still true. We work very well with those people, and we can complement them from getting you have to get go to market right. You have to get initial traction. You have to get the product market fit. You need to prove a foundation to scale the business before you'd ever consider raising outside capital or putting fuel on the fire. So it still holds. Don't get me wrong. But what we've actually seen in York IE is that we work with Genesis stage companies all the way to, I think our biggest client, 60 million ARR, right? And we have product, go to market, finance, and strategy support for those types of companies. At the earliest stages, though, the pre-Genesis stage, where we kind of started to meet, as well as the pre-seed seed stage, we've actually found more go-to-market or industry experts who see a gap in their space that software and technology and product capability can help automate, can help accelerate, can help fulfill. And that is across every sector. I mean, we have companies that are, AI for the meat processing industry, software platform for the shellfish traceability industry, fiber mapping software for the telecom and broadband space, right? Like totally random industries where software and technology is helping accelerate those industries. So we do a lot of vertical industry software with domain experts and business and go-to-market leaders who see that gap but need a hell of a lot of help in building product technology, scaling it to service those needs. So it's so important, the go-to-market, the sales side. It's the one thing sales you cannot outsource, right? You need to have your own team, even if you're being complemented by Shift's BDR as a service or by York IE's demand gen and marketing support. You still need to build your own engine and optimize that engine. And, I hate the companies like the MailChimps and the Twilios that act like we've scaled this way without sales, because at the end of the day, that is such a random outlier effect, and every organization needs to make sure they have the competency.
Totally, 100%. I'm glad you put it that way, because it's so true. Like, and at the end of the day, like, you need that ownership internally, because that's ultimately, you could have the best product in the world. If you don't get that right and nobody wants to give you money for it, nobody cares, right?
Yeah, totally. And York IE's position is like, we want our advisory as a service business to be an extension of the operating teams we support, not the operating team, right? Like, so it's about helping companies, plug their gaps, fill their holes, realize what they need to have on their own team versus what they can leverage partners for, scale efficiently and effectively, because go-to-market and product investment can be very inefficient, as we know, and we're seeing the market get corrected around right now. So that's where we really come in, is to help with that strategic growth and make sure that companies are doing it as thoughtfully and pragmatically as possible.
I love it. Well, Kyle, you've given us a lot of time today. We appreciate it. I'm going to ask you the two final questions we ask every guest. First one, why do you love sales, Kyle?
It's that energy. We talked about my best memories of playing sports growing up was Friday Night Lights. Nothing like the euphoria of winning that big deal, of getting that signature. We have a big gong in our office. We have a virtual gong in our Slack channel. Like, hearing that thing hit, the rallying of the entire company that it does, there's nothing more invigorating than that.
It's the best, man. It's the best. Now, people always ask me, JR, how come you only focus on athletes and veterans? And I always explain, like, listen, I don't need to explain to them what it means to be dialed in. And I think as a sales professional, the guys that you think of when you think of the word dialed in, that is what it takes to really, like, make a career out of this and, like, really kind of, to your point, control your own destiny. So last question, what does it mean to be dialed in as a sales professional?
So what I think everybody needs to do is be the CEO of their own career. I've even written an ebook that's on our website for this. And it's really about setting a long-term vision for where you'd like to get, and then working your way backwards from what milestones you need to hit along the way and what execution you need to execute upon to reach those milestones. And in sales, there's nothing more bottoms up than that, right? How many calls do you need to make? What activities do you need to do? What deals do you need to win? Day over day, week over week, month over month, quarter over quarter, year over year. Then someday you wake up and you run and own your own company, like me and you, right? And this is all just part of the grand vision, part of the grand path that you've set for yourself. Like, companies set strategic plans, they have big visions, the strategic plan, and back to the execution of the day-to-day models. right? You should be doing that with your own career too. And the people who do that, it's not just about the grit and the grind. It's doing it for a greater purpose over time, and then weaving their company narrative into their career narrative. And those are the people who are the most dialed in and the most successful in the end.
I love it, because that's our message. Is it starts with, like, we call it imagination, but the idea is like the first thing you need to do is you need to picture where you're going to be in 5 to 10 years. Like, you need that vision and that purpose. Everything else builds off of that. So that was great. I love it. Kyle, thank you so much for joining the pod, brother. It was great to have you. This was an awesome conversation. I know our guests are going to get a ton out of it. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, JR, and keep up the great work. I love what you're doing for athletes and veterans out there. So here to support in any way.
Love it.
This wraps up this episode of Merchants of Change. If you enjoyed this episode, the most meaningful way to say thanks is to submit a review wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're interested in working with us, please come find us at www.shiftgroup.io.